The IMF recently made a forecast on Botswana's GDP output. By their assessments, the Botswana economy is going to grow about 6%. It's still below initial estimates of growth above 7%. What are some of the constraints that exist in Botswana at the moment?
Well, part of the problem, of course, is that even prior to the recent global economic crisis, we had seen this overall decline in trend growth in Botswana. The very big mining projects that resulted in close to double-digit growth early on, I guess that rise from a pretty low base that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s, well, those conditions are no longer fueling growth. So the country is going to have to come to terms with growth rates of between 6 to 7%. Not at all a bad performance on a sustained basis, but of course there is this need to seek out new engines for growth.
I mean, obviously, some of the challenges Botswana's had to face post-credit crisis is the ability to stimulate productivity in the economy, and that's led to the government running up a major deficit. It's even reached as much as 11% in recent years. Are we likely to see them continue with this counter-cyclical policy approach and increasing public spending?
Well, what we've seen from the authorities, of course, is a very firm commitment to cut that deficit. The deficit is seen as something of a relative one-off. During the crisis, there was a period when the mines were shut down that impacted greatly on fiscal revenue. And of course, at the same time, the government tried to increase the export base, develop the economic base of the country so they wouldn't be as dependent on a single commodity. This necessarily meant a lot of spending, development expenditure especially, and that's what led to the sort of record deficits that we had seen in the recent past. But what we're seeing from the authorities now is a very firm commitment, at least, to try to close that deficit, to restore a balanced budget by 2013. Very ambitious, but the spending plans that should lead to that being achieved are already underway.
Public spending and too much of it obviously drives up inflation, and inflation is expected to rise as much as 7.8%. Then you add to that the global situation of inflation rising because of food and fuel prices. How's that going to complicate the recovery in Botswana?
Okay, well, I guess the first thing is to look at exactly why inflation has been rising as strongly as it has. We're not so sure that it has very much to do with public spending. The nature of public spending matters, and of course a lot of what we've seen recently has been this big increase in development spending. Now, other things being equal, that isn't the kind of thing that drives up inflation. But we have seen administered price increases. Of course, inflation is currently elevated, partly because of that. There are some technical factors in there as well. We saw the increase in VAT last year, and of course, given the global picture, given rising food prices, given rising fuel prices, notwithstanding Botswana's efforts to smooth petrol prices, the cost of petrol isn't anything near where it is in South Africa. Despite that, inflation is going to be pressured. In looking at official forecasts from the Bank of Botswana, inflation's likely to stay above the objective range until the second quarter of 2012. Well, in our view, we might see a heightened inflationary experience and perhaps persisting for even longer than that.
Coping mechanisms available to the Treasury in Botswana. I mean, they've taken concessionary loans from the African Development Bank to support them in managing the budget. What else?
Well, the absolute priority for the moment still needs to be this issue of diversifying the economy. In a sense, a lot of the development spending that we've seen recently was aimed at doing exactly that. It was allowing for these new sectors to take off, new export engines, and of course Botswana is going to have to focus very carefully on what it does to raise revenue, because whether we're looking at mining related revenue, okay, there's healthy growth in mining, but we are looking looking at growing needs as the economy increases in size, whether we're looking at SACU revenue that is related to the customs union, which looks as though it will be cut steeply from around 2019, it's evident that the economy needs to look beyond what has traditionally been in place. Now, this means developing new sectors. It means maybe just taking a hard and fast look at the role of government in the economy. The kind of spending levels that we've seen in Botswana, 40% of GDP, can that necessarily be sustained in the medium term, the medium to longer term? Probably not.
Right. Okay, talking about this issue of economic diversification, we have seen a situation where recovery in a lot of African states has been predicated on the surge in commodity prices. Why has Botswana not been able to capitalize on this? Irrespective of why they depend so much on mining, why can't they just benefit from what's going on?
Well, we have, of course, seen a very encouraging export performance. It hasn't just been about diamonds, where prices received a considerable lift and evidence of growing global demand last year, but also in terms of copper, nickel, in terms of other minerals, Botswana is doing steadily better. The issue is whether steadily better is going to be good enough, and it's evident, given the sort of challenges that the economy faces, that more needs to be done. Now, very crucially, for a country that is landlocked, has had mining wealth, minerals related wealth, that can only get a country so far. That typically isn't the kind of growth that generates employment opportunities. For all of its economic success, Botswana still has a very high rate of unemployment. There's more that needs to be done. In our view, at Standard Chartered, services have to be the way forward. This is something that the authorities have focused on in the past, but of course a much more accommodative environment to grow much faster rates of growth needs to be the focus for Botswana.
Final question to you, Razia. In terms of ranking, and I'm not talking here credit worthiness ranking, it has been referred to as a middle income African economy. It has been referred to as the beacon of light in Africa by way of economic management and democracy. Can we still hold Botswana up as a shining example of the right kind of economic model that you'd find in Africa?
Yes, of course the initial years were much easier. Botswana really distinguished itself in the African space by doing all the right things with fiscal policy through its very conservative management of its mining wealth. Now the question, of course, is whether a different developmental model is needed, something that's less conservative, something that allows for faster growth and, more specifically, private sector-led growth. We don't just need that more rapid growth, it needs to be led by different economic agents. The government can only do so much. So there are certainly challenges facing Botswana's economy, and of course, given the nature of those challenges, it's not clear that the government alone can do what's needed to deliver on more rapid growth, but the building blocks that are in place, the rule of law, its history of stability, having been a democracy for its entire existence, these are still important starting points to have in place, and we think serve the economy incredibly well, even for the medium to longer term.